The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling old fences and carrying with it the faint sound of distant cars. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, a pair of tired, sunken eyes watched the world go by, hoping, waiting. He had once belonged to someone. He had once known the warmth of a home, the feeling of a gentle hand running through his fur, and the sound of a voice calling his name. But that was years ago, 5 years to be exact. His name? No one knew anymore. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. For half a decade, he had roamed the streets, scouring trash bins for scraps, curling up in abandoned corners to escape the cold, and dodging the cruel hands of those who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. His fur, once thick and golden, was now matted and dull. His ribs pressed against his fragile skin, and his once bright, trusting eyes were filled with nothing but exhaustion. People walked past him every day. Some barely spared him a glance. Others wrinkled their noses and turned away. A few, out of pity, tossed him leftover food, but no one stopped. No one asked how he had ended up there. No one wondered about the life he had before. And so, he waited. For what? He wasn't sure. Maybe for the person who had left him behind to come back. Maybe for someone, anyone, to see him, not just as another stray, but as a soul longing to be loved again. One cold evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the quiet town, something changed. A car pulled up to the curb, and a woman stepped out. She didn't look like the others who ignored him or shooed him away. She carried a soft expression, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in years, kindness. She set a small container on the ground, filled with warm food. The smell hit him instantly, awakening a hunger so deep it made his stomach ache. He hesitated. Was this another cruel trick? Would she grab him, hurt him, chase him away like so many others had? But then she spoke. Her voice was gentle, careful, as if she knew he had been hurt before. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. You don't have to be scared." He took a cautious step forward, his legs shaky from years of hardship. The woman didn't move, didn't rush him. She simply waited. And after what felt like forever, he finally gave in. The food was warm, soft, nothing like the spoiled scraps he had grown used to. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to comfort. That night, she returned. And the next night. And the night after that. Slowly, he began to trust her. He learned the sound of her car, the way her voice always carried warmth, the way she never reached for him too quickly. But trust, for a dog who had been abandoned, was not something easily given. So, he kept his distance. Then, one night, she did something different. Instead of just leaving food, she sat down on the pavement, a few feet away, and simply waited. No words, no movement, just patience. It was as if she understood that trust wasn't built in a day. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something stir in his heart. A memory, a feeling, a flicker of something he had almost forgotten, hope. But just when it seemed like things were changing, just when it seemed like he might finally find the love he had been missing for so long, fate had other plans. The next evening, as he waited in the same spot, tail faintly wagging in anticipation, something was different. The sound of her car never came. The scent of warm food never filled the air. He waited and waited, but she never showed up. Confused, he paced the sidewalk, ears twitching at every sound, eyes scanning every car that passed. Had she left him too? Just like before? Had he let himself believe, just for a moment, that he could be loved again, only to be reminded that love was not meant for dogs like him? The night grew colder, and the streets grew emptier. But he didn't move. He sat in the same spot, eyes fixed on the road, waiting for the one person who had seen him. The one person who had made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible after all. But the night passed, and she never came. And that's when something inside him broke. Little did he know, miles away, something had happened. Something that would change everything. And when the truth finally came to light, it would leave everyone who heard his story in tears. Because what happened next was something no one saw coming. The night stretched on, long and silent. The streetlights flickered above him, casting his shadow on the cold pavement. He didn't move. He didn't sleep. His tired eyes stayed locked on the road, waiting for the familiar hum of her car, the warmth of her voice, the smell of fresh food. But none of it came. The hunger in his belly was nothing new. He had learned to live with it, just like he had learned to live with loneliness. But this was different. This wasn't just another cold night with an empty stomach. This was the sting of betrayal creeping back into his heart, the kind of ache that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with loss. Had he been foolish to believe? Had he let his guard down too soon? The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying distant sounds of laughter from somewhere far away. People were going on with their lives, warm in their homes, surrounded by love, by family. But here he was alone, just like he had been for 5 long years. Morning came, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. He was still there, his body curled up near the curb, ears flicking at the sounds of the waking world. His legs ached, his fur damp with the night's chill. But he refused to move. What if she came back? What if she had just been late? Hours passed. Cars drove by. People hurried down the sidewalks, lost in their own lives. No one noticed the lonely dog waiting by the road, his eyes dull, his hopes slowly fading. And then something happened. A different car pulled up, slowing as it neared the spot where he sat. He lifted his head slightly, his heart pounding. Was it her? Had she finally come back? But as the door opened, disappointment hit him like a wave. It wasn't her. It was someone else, a man, unfamiliar and stiff in his movements. The man stepped out, adjusting his jacket, his gaze landing on the frail figure by the road. The dog flinched. He had learned long ago that strangers meant danger. He braced himself to be shooed away, yelled at, maybe even kicked. But the man didn't move closer. He just stood there, watching. And then he did something unexpected. He pulled out a phone. The dog didn't understand, but something in the man's eyes made him uneasy. There was a look of concern, yes, but also something else. A kind of urgency, like he knew something the dog didn't. Minutes passed. The man kept speaking into the phone, his voice low but firm. And then, before the dog could even think about running, another vehicle appeared. This one was different. It wasn't just a car, it was a van. The dog's body tensed. He had seen vans before. They never meant anything good. His instincts screamed at him to run, to disappear into the alleys where no one could find him. But his legs, weak from hunger, refused to obey. The van stopped, and the door slid open. A woman stepped out, her eyes scanning the street before landing on him. She took a slow step forward, crouching slightly, her hands open in a way that told him she meant no harm. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. The voice was different from the one he had come to know, but there was something familiar in it, something warm. Still, he didn't move. He didn't trust easily, not anymore. "I know you're scared," she continued, her voice gentle. "But you're not safe out here." Safe. That word had lost its meaning a long time ago. The man from earlier was still watching, his arms crossed, concern etched on his face. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small treat, holding it out without moving any closer. He wanted to run. He wanted to disappear. But there was something in her presence that held him still. Something that reminded him of the woman who had fed him night after night. The one who had made him believe, just for a little while, that he mattered. But she wasn't here. And that thought shattered him. He lowered his head, letting out a slow breath. The woman didn't push him, didn't try to grab him. She just waited. And that was what made all the difference. Minutes passed before he took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The smell of the treat was tempting, but it was something else pulling him in. Something deeper. A quiet, unspoken promise in her eyes. As he inched closer, the woman remained still, barely even breathing. Then, in the softest voice, she whispered, "That's it. You're okay." The moment his nose brushed against her fingers, something in him wavered. He hadn't let anyone get this close in years. But before he could decide what to do, before he could take the treat or turn away, a sudden noise shattered the moment. A loud horn, a slamming door. The dog jerked back instantly, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear, so deeply ingrained in him, took over. Without thinking, he turned, bolting down the street, his legs shaky but desperate to get away. He ran, and he didn't look back. The woman's voice called after him, but it was too late. He disappeared just like he always had. And somewhere, far away, in a small hospital room, the only person who had ever truly seen him was lying still, unconscious, unaware that the dog she had cared for, the one she had tried to save, was now more lost than ever. The streets blurred as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exhaustion. Fear pounded in his chest, a feeling he knew too well. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The woman, the van, the sudden noise, it was all too much. His heart had already been broken once. He couldn't risk trusting again. His paws hit the pavement hard as he weaved through alleys and side streets, his body moving on instinct. The city around him felt too big, too loud. People walked past, cars honked, lights flashed, but none of it mattered. He was alone again, just like before. After what felt like forever, his legs gave out. He collapsed in a quiet alley, his ribs rising and falling with each shaky breath. His body ached, his stomach gnawed with hunger, but the pain inside was worse. He had let himself believe, just for a moment, that things could change, that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and now she was gone. A rustling sound nearby made him lift his head slightly. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows. Another stray, a smaller dog, thin and scrappy, watching him with cautious curiosity. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the smaller dog took a step closer, sniffing the air. He didn't growl or show his teeth. Instead, he simply lowered his head, as if saying, "I understand." The big dog looked away. He didn't need company. He didn't want it. But the small one didn't leave. He circled once before lying down a few feet away, curling into himself against the cold. A quiet understanding passed between them. Two lost souls, too tired to fight, too broken to hope. Meanwhile, across town, the woman who had fed him all those nights remained still in a hospital bed. Machines beeped softly around her, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat the only sound in the room. She had been in an accident, a sudden, unavoidable moment that had left her unconscious and fragile. No one had called for her. No one had checked in. She lived alone, and the only soul who had been waiting for her was out there in the city, not knowing why she never came back. The shelter worker who had tried to save him sat in her office that night, staring at the report on her desk. The man who had called about the dog earlier had said he had been waiting for someone, that he had looked lost, like he was searching for something. It wasn't uncommon for abandoned dogs to linger in places where they once felt safe, but something about this case felt different. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. A dog waiting in the same spot for weeks. A woman who suddenly stopped showing up. There was a connection here, but she didn't know what it was yet. The next morning, she returned to the area with a few volunteers, hoping to find him again. But he was gone. The food she had left remained untouched. The street felt emptier without him. A part of her worried he had run too far, that he wouldn't survive another winter alone. The dog, now curled beside the small stray, twitched in his sleep. His dreams were filled with echoes of the past, the warmth of a home he barely remembered, the voice of a person who had once called him by name. The memory was distant, almost unreal. When he woke, the morning air was crisp, the streets quiet. The small dog beside him stretched before shaking off the cold, watching him with careful eyes. He should leave, keep moving, but something made him stay. Maybe it was the loneliness, the exhaustion, or maybe deep down he was tired of running. The small dog perked up suddenly, ears twitching at the sound of footsteps. A boy, no older than 10, stood at the alley entrance, his face lighting up at the sight of them. He carried a small backpack, his hands clutching a sandwich wrapped in paper. His clothes were worn, his hair messy, but his eyes held a familiar kindness. "Hey, doggy," the boy whispered, kneeling down a few feet away. He reached into his bag, pulling out a piece of bread, setting it gently on the ground before backing away. The big dog didn't move at first, his muscles tense. But the small stray wasted no time, darting forward to grab the food. The boy grinned, watching them, but he didn't try to touch them. He just sat there, content to share what little he had. The big dog hesitated, then slowly inched forward. Hunger won over fear, and he took a bite. It wasn't much, but it filled a part of him that had been empty for too long. The boy chuckled softly. "You remind me of someone," he murmured, mostly to himself. The dog tilted his head slightly, studying him. The boy didn't say more, but he came back later that day. And the next. And the next. Each time he brought small bits of food, staying just long enough to make sure they ate. He never reached out, never forced anything. He simply sat with them, much like the woman had done before. The big dog didn't know it yet, but the boy had his own story. A life not much different from his own, one filled with loss, waiting, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. And somewhere, in a hospital room, a woman stirred for the first time in days, her fingers twitching slightly as the beeping of the machines continued. The world kept moving. The pieces were shifting, but no one knew what would come next. The boy came every day, rain or shine, never expecting anything in return. He didn't try to pet them or force them closer. He just sat there, quietly sharing what little food he had. The small stray had grown bolder, wagging its tail whenever the boy arrived, but the big dog remained cautious. He had been let down too many times before, but something about the boy was different. His eyes carried a sadness that the dog recognized, a loneliness that felt all too familiar. Sometimes, after leaving the food, the boy would just sit there, staring at nothing, lost in his own thoughts. He wasn't just helping them. Maybe deep down he needed them too. One evening, the boy arrived later than usual, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. His movements were tense, and when he sat down, he let out a shaky breath. The dog watched him closely. Something was wrong. The boy sniffed, rubbing at his eyes before pulling out a sandwich and setting it down like he always did. But this time he didn't move back. He just sat there, hugging his knees. The big dog hesitated before stepping forward, his instincts fighting against years of mistrust. But the boy didn't reach for him. He didn't even look up. So, for the first time, the dog inched closer, not just for the food, but for something else, something he didn't quite understand yet. The boy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go home." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. The dog didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Home wasn't always safe. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve, glancing at the dog for the first time. "You get it, don't you?" He let out a soft, bitter laugh. "That's why you're out here too." The dog lowered his head, watching him carefully. The small stray had curled up beside the boy's foot, sensing his sadness, offering quiet comfort. For a long time, they just sat there, three souls who didn't belong anywhere, finding something close to home in each other. But peace never lasted. That night, after the boy left, the dog sensed something in the air. A shift, a feeling. He had learned to trust those feelings. They had kept him alive for 5 long years. And right now, something felt wrong. The small dog whimpered beside him, ears twitching. The big dog lifted his head, listening, the distant sound of tires screeching. A voice, angry, slurred, echoed through the empty streets. Then a shout. The dog stood up instantly. The voice, it was the boy's. His heart pounded as he bolted from the alley, the small stray following close behind. His legs ached, but he pushed forward, following the sound, his instincts screaming at him to move faster. Then he saw them. The boy was backed against a wall, his small frame trembling. A man, tall, unsteady, stood in front of him, his fists clenched. His words were sharp, cutting through the cold night air. The dog couldn't understand them, but he understood the fear in the boy's eyes. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. With a deep, guttural growl, he lunged forward, placing himself between the boy and the man. His fur bristled, his teeth bared. The small stray followed his lead, barking frantically. The man cursed, stumbling back slightly. "Stupid strays, get lost." But the big dog didn't move. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was standing his ground. The man lifted his hand, and the dog flinched, old instincts telling him to brace for pain. But then, a sound, a car. Headlights flooded the alley, and suddenly, the man turned, stumbling away into the darkness. The boy let out a shaky breath, pressing himself against the wall. The car door slammed. Footsteps rushed toward them. Then a voice, a familiar one, the shelter worker. She had been looking for him, but now she had found something else, someone else, who needed saving just as much. The boy wiped at his face quickly, trying to hide his fear. "I wasn't scared," he muttered, but his voice wavered. The woman knelt down, her eyes filled with concern. "It's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to explain." She looked at the dog, at the way he stood protectively in front of the boy, his body tense, ready to fight again if he had to. Slowly, she reached out a hand, but not toward the dog. Toward the boy. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" The boy hesitated. His eyes darted toward the street where the man had disappeared, then back at the dog. The woman noticed. Her expression softened. "Come with me," she offered. "Both of you." The boy swallowed hard. "And them?" He glanced down at the dogs. She smiled softly. "Especially them." The boy bit his lip, hesitating. Then, with a slow nod, he reached for her hand. The dog didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if this was another promise that would break, another hope that would fade. But as he followed them toward the car, something in his chest felt different. Like maybe, just maybe, the waiting was finally over. The car ride was silent, except for the occasional sniffle from the boy and the steady hum of the engine. The big dog lay on the back seat, his body still tense, eyes darting between the boy and the woman driving. The small stray was curled up beside him, its tiny body shivering, either from the cold or from everything that had just happened. The dog could still feel the energy of that moment, the anger in the man's voice, the fear in the boy's eyes. He didn't understand every human word, but he knew what danger felt like. The boy stared out the window, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. "Where are we going?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. The woman glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Somewhere safe," she said. "Just for tonight. We'll figure everything else out in the morning." The boy didn't reply, but he didn't argue either. He just leaned his forehead against the window, exhaling slowly. The big dog watched him, recognizing that look, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. It was the same way he had felt for the past 5 years. The car turned down a dark street, the lights from the city growing more distant. Then, the woman pulled into the driveway of a small house. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was warm. The second she opened the door, a soft glow spilled out onto the porch, chasing away the night's cold. She led them inside, flicking on the lights. "You can sleep here," she told the boy, motioning toward a couch. Then she looked down at the dogs. "And you too." She paused, smiling slightly. "I think you've earned a warm place too." The boy hesitated before slowly sitting down on the couch, kicking off his worn-out shoes. He looked smaller under the yellow light, like all his energy had drained the moment they were inside. The big dog didn't lie down right away. He stayed near the door, ears flicking, waiting for something, anything, to go wrong. Because it always did. The woman disappeared for a moment and returned with a blanket, draping it over the boy's shoulders. He stiffened at first, but then, almost reluctantly, he pulled it closer. "Thanks," he mumbled, not looking up. The small stray immediately found a corner to curl up in, but the big dog stayed put, his eyes still scanning the room, listening for sounds beyond the walls. The woman noticed. "You don't have to be on guard anymore," she said softly. "You're safe now." The words were kind, but words had never meant much to him before. Still, exhaustion weighed on his bones, and after a long moment, he finally lay down, his head resting against his paws. For the first time in a long time, sleep came easily, but peace never lasted. It was sometime in the middle of the night when the dog's eyes snapped open. A sound, a presence. His instincts kicked in immediately. He lifted his head, ears straining, his body already tensing. Something wasn't right. Then, a noise outside, a slow creak. He rose to his feet silently, his muscles tight. The small stray lifted its head too, sensing the shift in energy. The woman was asleep in her room. The boy was curled up under the blanket, his breathing deep and steady. But outside, something moved. The dog padded carefully toward the door, sniffing the air. Then he heard it footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He let out a low growl. The sound woke the boy instantly. "What is it?" His voice was groggy, but when he saw the dog's posture, the way his fur stood on end, his sleepiness disappeared. Then a knock. Not the kind of knock people use when they're supposed to be there. The boy shot up, his body rigid. The woman's footsteps echoed down the hall as she rushed into the living room, her face clouded with confusion. "Who would come here this late?" she murmured. The dog already knew the answer. The woman reached for the door, but before she could open it, something made her hesitate. A feeling, an instinct. Instead, she peered through the small window beside the door. The second she did, her entire body went stiff. The boy's heart pounded. "Who is it?" The woman didn't answer at first, but then she whispered one word, a name. The boy's face paled. His father. The dog growled louder, stepping in front of the boy without thinking. The woman turned quickly, her voice hushed but urgent. "Go to the back room. Now." The boy didn't move. He found me?" His voice shook. The knock came again. This time, harder. The dog's muscles coiled, ready to lunge if he had to. The woman squared her shoulders. "I'm going to handle this, but I need you both to stay out of sight." The boy swallowed hard, but he nodded. Without another word, he turned and ran toward the back room, the big dog right at his heels. The small stray hesitated before following, its tiny frame trembling. The door creaked open slightly, and the woman's voice was calm but firm. "It's late. You shouldn't be here." A deep voice rumbled from outside. "That's my kid in there." Her voice didn't waver. "He's somewhere safe. I want him back." "He's not a possession," she shot back. "You don't just get to take him because you feel like it." A tense silence filled the air. Then a step forward. The dog's body stayed rigid, his breath slow, controlled. He knew the sound of a fight before it even started. And right now, he could tell this wasn't over. The dog stood in the darkened room, his body tense, every muscle ready to spring. The boy was behind him, sitting on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide with fear. The small stray trembled beside them, ears flattened. Outside, the voices continued, low but sharp, like the quiet before a storm. The woman didn't back down. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "This isn't the time or the place." The man let out a sharp breath, his frustration obvious. "You don't understand," he muttered. "He's my son." "He's a child," she corrected. "And he's terrified of you." Silence. The boy's breath hitched. The dog could hear his heartbeat, fast and unsteady. The boy wasn't just scared. He was reliving something painful. The dog didn't know exactly what had happened in that house, but he didn't need to. He had seen enough to understand. Then, the man's voice changed. It softened, but not in a way that felt safe. "I just want to talk to him." The woman didn't move. "If he wanted to see you, he wouldn't have run." The dog stepped forward slightly, his instincts screaming that this wasn't over. The man wasn't going to walk away that easily. The boy gripped the dog's fur tightly, as if grounding himself. Then the sound of a car approaching. Headlights cut through the darkness. Another voice, a firm, authoritative one. "Sir, step away from the door." The tension in the air shifted instantly. The dog didn't know who had come, but he could tell. The fight was over. The woman exhaled, her posture relaxing slightly. The man cursed under his breath, but didn't resist. The boy slowly stood up, still gripping the dog. "Who is that?" he whispered. The woman turned slightly. "The police." The boy's grip tightened. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or afraid. The dog nudged his hand gently, grounding him. The small stray let out a soft whimper. A few muffled words were exchanged outside. The man's voice grew more defensive, but he didn't fight back. Soon, footsteps retreated, the sound of tires rolling away into the night. The woman let out a breath she had been holding. "It's over," she murmured. The boy didn't move at first. He stayed frozen in place, his fingers still gripping the dog's fur like he was afraid to let go. But then, slowly, he exhaled. His shoulders dropped. The woman knelt in front of him. "You're safe now," she said gently. "You don't have to go back." The boy looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his tired eyes. "But Where do I go? She smiled softly. Let's figure that out together. The dog watched as something shifted in the boy's expression, something hesitant, but hopeful. He had spent so long running, never knowing if there was a place for him. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found one. The dog understood that feeling. For the first time in 5 years, he let his guard down completely. The next few days passed in a blur. The boy stayed in the woman's home, quieter than usual, but slowly warming up. The shelter checked in often, helping sort out paperwork, making sure the boy had what he needed. And through it all, the dog stayed by his side. One afternoon, as they sat outside, the boy spoke up. So, what happens to him now? He nodded toward the big dog, who was lying beside him, eyes half closed. The woman smiled. That depends on him. The boy frowned slightly. What do you mean? Well, she said, sitting beside him. He's been on his own for a long time. But I think he's finally found someone he trusts. The boy hesitated, glancing down at the dog. He reached out, running his fingers through the thick fur. Does that mean he can stay? The woman's eyes softened. Only if you want him to. The boy's face lit up, not a big, obvious smile, but something small and real. He looked at the dog, who gazed back at him, calm and steady. For the first time, the boy didn't feel alone. And for the first time, the dog wasn't waiting for someone to come back, because he had already found where he belonged. And this time, no one was going to leave. The small stray wagged its tail beside them, curling up next to the big dog, completing the little family neither of them had ever expected to have. The past couldn't be changed, but the future, well, that was something they would face together.